One of the most difficult things we can do when we have certain childhoods is develop this internalization that everything is our fault and everyone is mad at us. It's like at any given moment, it always flows back to us, and this sense of self-blame, oftentimes internalized shame, and just a sense of, as I've talked about, being the bad child or not good enough or unworthy or unlovable and all of those things. So this often is really common in complex PTSD and internalized relational traumas, where there's something that happened that led us to believe that these things are our fault. It's especially common in childhood, where before we have real language, we are what we call egocentric. And so we think that everything is about us, right? If I wish the wizard will come, he will. If I wish it to rain or a rainbow will happen, it will happen. It's part of our brain development that we eventually learn over time actually doesn't work that way. But long before we have that internal ability from a cognitive perspective, we've often absorbed that it's our fault. And that is because oftentimes, as I've said, and everyone talks about, that if you were led to believe that it was either you or your caregivers who were at fault, and you're a helpless child, it is so much easier to blame yourself than to blame your caregivers. And oftentimes we think that they have it all figured out. And we realize as we get older that they're just adults, they're just bigger people trying to figure it out just like we are. They just knew more at a certain time perhaps than we did. So, but the bottom line is it goes back to it's always my fault, and we self-blame. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is understand that when you're looking at a situation where you say, oh, is this my fault or not, is to sort of try to look at it from a more cognitive perspective, where you say, okay, is this just an old tape in my head where I believe this, or do I have some actual responsibility here? So you might get a piece of paper out and write down, okay, if this belongs to me, if I am believing that it's my fault, what parts of this are my fault? Maybe I said this thing disrespectfully, or I was insensitive, or whatever. There might be a place where you do have some responsibility, but you might also be taking it way too far. So it's like, yeah, I did say that thing and I need to own that and apologize, but that doesn't make me a bad person or a bad partner. It just means that I was being insensitive. I need to own that, repair that. But look at, does anything belong to me here? And if it does, then go figure it out. Go make repairs, go work on your behavior. But like, what belongs to me and what doesn't is a good place to start. And I would challenge yourself there, even when you think you've got the answer, to kind of, look at the problem from a full perspective before you decide how much belongs to you. And then to look at maybe writing down, what are the themes? What is the language I tell myself? For me, it's like, I go back to, oh, it's my fault, right? So my kids have trauma. It's because of who I chose. And even though I didn't cause the trauma intentionally, they had trauma. And then maybe they're adults now, but it's still my fault. Like, everything's my fault. And maybe there are things that actually are for sure as a result of things I was wounded about or didn't know. But I'm also removing any of their responsibility, that they do have some ownership in things. And A, that's not fair to me, but B, it's not fair to them, right? So whatever your tapes are, it's my fault. I'm a bad child. I'm unworthy. I'm unlovable. All of the above. It's good to know what those are so you can quickly recognize when that's happening. The next thing is to ask yourself, like, who am I? If my narrative is I'm the bad child, but like we all know that's just one part of what I believe. You can't likely believe that all of you is bad, that all the parts of you are bad. Who are you? Oh, I'm a loving parent. I'm a good friend. I'm a passionate therapist, whatever it is. I'm a dedicated gymnast, whatever it is. So look at, who are you? I really believe that we lose ourselves in terms of what our qualities are, our identity in childhood, and many of us have to really rebuild that from the inside out, often completely by ourselves as adults. So that's part of that work. You can do identity work there, but really look at like the holistic perspective of who you are. The next one is to recognize that what I just said, which is that there's a multifaceted part to who you are, to take a holistic view that you are parts. So a part of you might be disrespectful. A part of you might be insensitive or selfish. But another part of you is loving and kind and helpful and good. And so recognize that nothing is all good or all bad or all right or all wrong. And that's that splitting thing that we often have as a result of our parents splitting, especially if they had more untreated borderline or narcissistic disorders. That's a very common thing for them. And so they kind of say, here, hold these yucky feelings. I don't want to hold them. These are yours to hold. And we say, okay, I'll hold them as kids. And then we grow up in the world and do the same thing, right? We don't necessarily have those disorders, but we split ourselves. So challenge the idea that there's all one thing or another that defines who you are, and maybe make a circle, like I say, a slice of pizza, and name those parts, the parts that you're most connected to, the parts you don't want to be connected to. Just try to look at yourself from a fuller perspective. And then look at what is my core wound being triggered here, which goes back to what I was saying is, where did that come from? You know, if we had a childhood where we weren't emotionally safe, one of the core wounds can be that people are not safe. And so let's say for me, let's say I've talked about trust is a common one with certain childhoods. If at the core, humans are the trigger, at the core, people aren't safe, at the core, I'm kind of on my own, then what does that say? It always says that if anything bad happens, oftentimes it's because people aren't safe, which is a broad brush to paint everyone with. And therefore, everything bad that happens is my fault because I put myself in this relationship, or I didn't see the signs, or I didn't see the red flags. Whatever it is, we have to look at the fact that there are these core wounds about, you know, people aren't safe, or they're not trustworthy, or I'm bad, I'm unlovable, all of those things. And so when you understand, as I've talked about your core wound, for me, it was at the very deepest core, I wanted security and stability. I wanted to have this like fantasy life as an adult, as a mommy, all these things. And that longing for that kept me from seeing the reality of the relationship I was choosing, because it seemed stable enough on the outside. And not taking enough time and understanding myself meant that I bought something that I thought was safety that was actually the opposite of safety. It was a re-traumatization. It was always going to play out that way. And so the core wound for me was, for most of us, we want security and stability, but we don't understand that the old patterns of childhood and caregivers are often showing up in the partners we choose in different clothing. And so the more you understand that, it doesn't guarantee you won't make the same mistakes, but I think it gives you a lot more powerful knowledge when you begin to evaluate relationships. So the next one is, of course, typical self-compassion, inner child work. You know, it's okay, it's not all your fault. You're not a bad child, you're a loving person, you deserve this treat, you deserve good things, going and doing something for yourself, you know, setting a boundary, things like that. And then lastly is really being honest with yourself. It's like, how do I want to respond to myself when I'm being harsh? Write it down when you're in a good place. What is the formula or the pattern I'd like to follow? I'd like to challenge myself, I'd like to give love to myself, I'd like to hold myself accountable, I'd like to give myself grace. I want to check in with my core wounds and see if this is just really about that and not even about the situation, and what can I do about it or not. So just to kind of get clear on that, you know, those are some things you can do when you're going down that kind of rabbit hole of everything is your fault, or you're always blaming yourself, especially if you had a more relationally traumatic childhood or adult relationship, you know, kind of wound. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.